The screams cut through the afternoon air like broken glass, piercing the lazy summer atmosphere that had settled over Willowbrook Community's pristine swimming pool. 11-year-old Sam Martinez thrashed in the grip of Karen Hendricks, the self-appointed HOA enforcement officer, as she dragged his dripping, overweight frame across the hot concrete deck. His goggles dangled from one ear, and chlorinated water streamed from his dark hair as he struggled against her iron grip on his upper arm. "Let me go! I wasn't doing anything wrong." Sam's voice cracked with panic and humiliation as dozens of neighbors looked on in stunned silence. Children stopped their games mid-splash. Parents lowered their magazines, and even the lifeguard stood frozen on his elevated chair, unsure whether to intervene in what appeared to be an adult disciplining a child. Karen's face flushed red beneath her oversized sun hat, her lips pressed into a thin line of righteous indignation. "You're taking up too much space in that pool. Young man, this isn't SeaWorld, and we don't need whales disrupting everyone else's enjoyment." Her voice carried across the water with cruel clarity, ensuring every witness heard each cutting word. The boy's shoulders shook with more than just the shock of being yanked from the warm water into the blazing July heat. At 11 years old, Sam had struggled with his weight for most of his life, a consequence of the medication he took for his chronic asthma and the limited physical activities his condition allowed. Swimming had become his sanctuary, the one place where his body felt graceful and free, where the water supported him instead of gravity working against him. Just 30 minutes earlier, Sam had been laughing with his neighborhood friends, playing a spirited game of Marco Polo that had everyone, including the adults, smiling at their infectious joy. Mrs. Patterson had complimented him on his improved backstroke technique, and Tommy Chen had asked him to be on his team for the upcoming pool volleyball game. For those precious moments, Sam had felt like any other kid enjoying a perfect summer day. Now, as Karen's manicured nails dug into his skin, leaving red marks that would bruise by evening, Sam felt the familiar weight of shame settling over him like a suffocating blanket. The other children stared with wide eyes, their parents whispering behind raised hands, and he could feel their pity like physical pressure against his chest. "Please, Mrs. Hendricks, I was just swimming. My doctor says it's good exercise for me." Sam's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, but Karen's expression only hardened further. "Don't you dare talk back to me. You little—" She caught herself before completing the sentence, perhaps remembering they had an audience, but her meaning hung in the air like toxic smoke. "Your mother obviously hasn't taught you proper manners or portion control. Maybe she needs to hear about your disruptive behavior today." The threat hit Sam like a physical blow. His mother worked incredibly long hours in a demanding job that often kept her away from home well into the evening. The last thing he wanted was to add to her stress with complaints about his behavior, especially when he knew he hadn't done anything wrong. But Karen's reputation in the Willowbrook community preceded her like a storm warning, and everyone knew that crossing her meant months of petty harassment and vindictive rule enforcement. Karen had moved into the community 18 months ago, a recent divorcee in her early 50s who seemed determined to find purpose through controlling others. She had appointed herself the unofficial enforcer of every HOA rule, regulation, and community guideline, often interpreting them in the strictest possible manner. Her daily patrols of the neighborhood had become legendary among residents, who would warn each other via group texts when they spotted her fluorescent green golf cart making its rounds. "From now on, pool hours for you are limited to early morning only, before 7 a.m., when decent families aren't trying to enjoy their recreational time," Karen announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "And if I catch you disrupting the peace again, you'll be banned entirely. Do you understand me?" Sam nodded mutely, his throat too tight with unshed tears to form words. Early morning pool hours meant he would essentially be banned anyway, since his mother left for work at 6:30 and couldn't supervise him that early. The community rules required children under 12 to have adult supervision while swimming, a safety measure Sam had never questioned until this moment, when it became the tool of his exclusion. As Karen finally released his arm and stormed away, her flip-flops slapping against the concrete in an angry rhythm, Sam stood dripping and alone while the other pool-goers slowly returned to their activities. The moment felt suspended in time, crystallized by shame and injustice. But what Sam didn't know was that Mrs. Rodriguez, the retired teacher who lived in the corner unit, had been recording the entire encounter on her phone. 30 miles away in the state capitol, Attorney General Maria Martinez was reviewing case files in her corner office when her phone buzzed with an urgent message. She had earned her reputation as one of the state's most formidable prosecutors through 2 decades of fighting for justice, particularly in cases involving discrimination and civil rights violations. Her colleagues respected her methodical approach to building cases, her thorough understanding of the law, and her unwavering commitment to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. But Maria's most important role wasn't Attorney General of the state. It was being Sam's mother. The video Mrs. Rodriguez sent made Maria's blood run cold. She watched her son being humiliated and manhandled by a woman whose face she didn't recognize, heard the cruel words about his weight, saw the shame in his posture as he was dragged from the water like some kind of criminal. Her hands trembled slightly as she replayed the video, her legal mind automatically cataloging each element that constituted harassment, discrimination, and potentially even assault of a minor. Maria had worked late countless nights to build the career that allowed her to provide for Sam as a single mother. But she had always made sure he felt loved and supported despite her demanding schedule. She knew about his struggles with his weight, about the kids who sometimes teased him at school, about his joy when he discovered that swimming made him feel strong and confident. She had specifically chosen their home in Willowbrook community because of its inclusive atmosphere and excellent recreational facilities. The irony wasn't lost on her that while she spent her days prosecuting discrimination cases across the state, her own son was being victimized in their own neighborhood by someone who clearly felt entitled to target a vulnerable child. But Karen Hendricks had made a critical error in judgment. She had assumed that Sam was just another kid she could bully without consequences, not knowing that his mother possessed both the legal authority and the personal motivation to ensure justice was served. Maria's assistant knocked on her door, bringing the afternoon's priority files, but she waved him away with a distracted gesture. "Cancel my 4 o'clock meeting and reschedule tomorrow's deposition," she said, her voice carrying the steel that her opponents had learned to recognize as dangerous. "I have a community matter that requires my immediate attention." Back at Willowbrook Community, Sam sat alone in his room, still wearing his damp swim trunks because changing clothes felt like admitting defeat. He could hear the sounds of other children playing in the pool through his open window, their laughter a stark contrast to the silence that had fallen over the deck when Karen had made her pronouncement. His mother wouldn't be home for another 3 hours, and he dreaded having to tell her what had happened. Meanwhile, Karen was holding court at the community center, regaling anyone who would listen with her version of the afternoon's events. That boy was completely out of control, she told the small group of residents who had gathered for the weekly book club meeting. Someone had to take charge of the situation before he hurt someone or damaged property. His mother clearly isn't teaching him proper pool etiquette. Several of the book club members exchanged uncomfortable glances, but Karen seemed oblivious to their discomfort. She had always possessed an remarkable ability to convince herself that her cruelest actions were actually necessary community service, transforming her prejudices into righteous civic duty in her own mind. "I've been keeping detailed records of problem residents," Karen continued, pulling out a thick folder she had labeled Community Violations. That family has been on my watch list since they moved in. The mother works all hours, leaving that child unsupervised. And now we're seeing the results of that neglect. What Karen didn't notice was that Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who had complimented Sam's swimming earlier, quietly excused herself from the book club and walked directly to the community manager's office. She had been a middle school principal for 37 years before retiring, and she recognized bullying when she saw it, regardless of the age of the perpetrator. The next morning arrived with an unseasonal coolness that made the community's residents pull light sweaters from their closers and brew stronger coffee than usual. Sam woke early, partly from habit and partly because sleep had eluded him for most of the night. He dressed slowly, choosing a loose-fitting t-shirt that would hide his shape, and joined his mother in the kitchen for their usual quick breakfast before she left for work. Maria studied her son's face across the small dining table, noting the shadows under his eyes and the way he pushed his cereal around the bowl without eating much. "How was your day yesterday, mijo?" she asked casually, though every muscle in her body was tense with controlled fury. Sam shrugged, not meeting her eyes. "Fine. Just regular summer stuff." He had decided during his sleepless hours that he wouldn't tell his mother about the pool incident. She had enough stress in her life without worrying about his problems. And besides, what could she really do? Karen was the HOA enforcer, and his mother was just another resident who had to follow the community rules. But Maria hadn't become the state's top prosecutor by accepting surface answers when she knew deeper truths were hiding underneath. "Mrs. Rodriguez sent me an interesting video yesterday," she said quietly, pulling out her phone and placing it on the table between them. Sam's face went white, then red, then settled into a mask of resigned embarrassment. "You saw it," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the morning sounds of coffee brewing and birds singing outside their window. "I saw it," Maria confirmed, her voice gentle but underlaid with the kind of controlled anger that had made seasoned defense attorneys nervous in courtrooms across the state. "And now, I want to hear your version of what happened." The story poured out of Sam in a rush of words and held back tears. He told her about the swimming lesson with Mrs. Patterson, about the game of Marco Polo with his friends, about the sudden appearance of Karen and her accusations. He described the feeling of her grip on his arm, the humiliation of being dragged from the water in front of everyone, the cruel comments about his weight and their family. "She said I could only swim before 7 in the morning." Sam finished, his voice breaking slightly. "But you leave for work at 6:30, so that means I can't swim at all anymore. And she said if she caught me disrupting anything again, I'd be banned completely." Maria reached across the table and took her son's hands in hers, feeling the calluses he had developed from his newfound love of swimming. "Sam, look at me," she said firmly, when his eyes met hers. She continued, "What happened to you yesterday was wrong. It was illegal. It was cruel. And it's not going to happen again. Do you understand me?" Sam nodded, though confusion clouded his features. His mother worked in some kind of legal job. He knew, but he had never really understood the extent of her power or influence. To him, she was just Mom, who made sure he took his asthma medication and helped him with homework and worried about him when he was sad. "I want you to go to school today and have a normal day," Maria continued, her voice taking on the crisp, authoritative tone she used when issuing legal directives. "Tonight, there's an emergency HOA board meeting that's been called to address community conduct issues. I'll be attending that meeting, and after tonight, I don't think you'll have any more problems using the pool." The emergency HOA board meeting had been scheduled after Mrs. Patterson and several other residents had demanded immediate action regarding what they termed Discriminatory harassment of a community member. The community manager, Mr. Foster, had initially tried to schedule the meeting for the following week, but the volume of complaints and the legal language some residents were using had convinced him that immediate attention was required. Karen arrived at the community center that evening, dressed in her most official-looking outfit. A navy blue blazer with gold buttons that she believed gave her an air of authority. She carried her folder of community violations and had prepared a presentation about maintaining standards and ensuring proper behavior from all residents, especially children whose parents weren't providing adequate supervision. The meeting room filled quickly with residents who rarely attended board meetings, creating an energy that felt more like a town hall than a routine HOA gathering. Mrs. Rodriguez sat in the front row with her phone ready to record. Mrs. Patterson had brought a stack of printed emails from concerned neighbors, and even teenagers like Tommy Chen had convinced their parents to attend. Maria arrived precisely on time, her appearance causing a ripple of recognition among the long-term residents who had seen her picture in the local newspaper or on television. She wore a simple charcoal gray suit that somehow managed to command immediate respect, and she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to walking into hostile rooms and emerging victorious. Karen didn't recognize her initially, focused as she was on her presentation materials and the folder of violations she planned to reference. It wasn't until Mr. Foster called the meeting to order and asked Maria to introduce herself that Karen's face began to change color. "My name is Maria Martinez," she began, her voice carrying easily through the packed room without raising her volume. "I'm Sam Martinez's mother, and I serve as the Attorney General for the state name. I'm here tonight to address what appears to be a pattern of discriminatory harassment targeting my son and potentially other vulnerable members of our community." The silence that followed her introduction was so complete that the air conditioning system seemed unnaturally loud. Karen's folder slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers, scattering papers across the floor as the full implications of the situation crashed over her like a tsunami of legal consequences. Maria continued speaking with the measured pace of someone who had delivered closing arguments in dozens of high-profile cases. "Yesterday afternoon, my 11-year-old son was physically assaulted, publicly humiliated, and subjected to discriminatory treatment based on his physical appearance. This treatment was administered by an individual who claims to act with the authority of this homeowners association, creating potential liability for every member of this community." She paused, letting her words sink in while she opened her own folder, which contained printed emails, legal statutes, and screenshots from the video that had been circulating among residents since Mrs. Rodriguez had shared it. "I have here documented evidence of harassment, discrimination based on physical characteristics, assault of a minor, and violation of this community's own anti-discrimination policies. I also have witness statements from 17 residents who observed yesterday's incident and were troubled enough by what they saw to contact me directly." Karen found her voice, though it came out as more of a squeak than her usual commanding tone. "Now wait just a minute. I was simply enforcing community standards and ensuring pool safety. That boy was being disruptive and taking up excessive space during peak usage hours." "Mrs. Hendricks," Maria replied, her voice taking on the cutting edge that had made her famous in legal circles. "You physically grabbed and dragged an 11-year-old child from a swimming pool while making derogatory comments about his weight and family situation. You then imposed arbitrary restrictions on his pool access that violate both community guidelines and federal anti-discrimination laws. These actions were recorded on video and witnessed by dozens of community members." She clicked open her laptop and connected it to the room's projection system, filling the wall-mounted screen with legal documents that made several board members shift uncomfortably in their seats. Under State Statute 18-3203, What you did yesterday constitutes assault against a minor. Under federal fair housing laws, restricting access to community amenities based on physical characteristics constitutes discrimination. And, under this community's own governing documents, harassment of residents is grounds for immediate removal from any official or unofficial enforcement roles. The legal terminology flew over the heads of many residents, but the implications were crystal clear. Karen had not simply bullied a child. She had committed crimes that carried both civil and criminal penalties, and she had done so while claiming to represent the Homeowners Association, potentially exposing every member to legal liability. Mr. Foster, the community manager, had gone pale as he realized the magnitude of the situation. Attorney General Martinez, he began carefully. The board was not aware of the specific details of yesterday's incident. We certainly don't condone any form of harassment or discrimination, and Mrs. Hendricks was not acting in any official capacity endorsed by the HOA board. That's interesting, Maria replied, pulling out another document, because I have here copies of emails where Mrs. Hendricks explicitly states that she's conducting official HOA enforcement rounds and refers to herself as the Community Compliance Officer. I also have records showing that she's been filing formal violation reports using official HOA letterhead, which she somehow obtained despite having no official appointment to any board position. The revelation sent murmurs rippling through the room as residents realized that Karen had been operating under false authority for months, perhaps years. Many of the violation notices, fines, and restrictions that had made their lives miserable had been issued by someone with no legal right to enforce anything. Karen's face had progressed from pale to red to a sickly green color as she realized the legal quicksand she had unknowingly stepped into. I was just trying to maintain community standards, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmurs of increasingly angry residents. Someone had to enforce the rules when the board wasn't taking action. Mrs. Hendricks, Maria said, her voice softening slightly with what might have been pity. Nobody appointed you to enforce anything. You took it upon yourself to harass, intimidate, and discriminate against residents, including children, while falsely claiming authority you never possessed. The consequences of those choices are now catching up with you. She turned to address the room at large, her voice carrying the authority of her office and the passion of a mother protecting her child. My son is 11 years old. He struggles with his weight due to medical conditions, and swimming is one of the few physical activities that brings him joy and helps with his health. Yesterday, he was humiliated and excluded from his favorite activity by someone who decided that his appearance made him unworthy of equal access to community amenities. Maria's voice grew stronger as she continued, but Sam isn't the only victim here. How many other residents have been intimidated by false authority? How many families have paid illegal fines or accepted arbitrary restrictions because they believed Mrs. Hendricks had the right to impose them? How many children have been made to feel unwelcome in their own community? The murmurs grew louder as residents began sharing their own stories of Karen's harassment. The elderly, Mr. Chen, had been cited for having too many garden gnomes. The young mother in Unit 47 had been fined for her children's sidewalk chalk art. And the college student who worked nights had been repeatedly harassed about his unusual sleep schedule. Mrs. Patterson stood up from her seat in the front row, her voice carrying the authority of her decades as an educator. I've been watching this woman terrorize families for over a year, she announced. Yesterday, when I saw her put her hands on that sweet boy and humiliate him in front of his friends, I knew it had gone too far. Sam Martinez is one of the kindest, most polite children in this community, and what she did to him was inexcusable. Tommy Chen's mother stood next, her voice shaking with emotion. My son asked me last night why Sam looked so sad when he left the pool. When I told him what happened, Tommy cried. He said Sam is his best friend, and he doesn't understand why anyone would be mean to him, just because he's bigger than other kids. One by one, residents began standing to share their support for Sam and their outrage at Karen's behavior. The meeting that had begun as a formal hearing was transforming into a community rally, with neighbors who had rarely spoken to each other finding common ground in their shared disgust at the harassment of a child. Maria watched the community unite around her son with emotions she rarely allowed herself to feel during professional proceedings. As Attorney General, she had prosecuted countless cases of discrimination and harassment, but seeing her neighbors stand up for Sam felt like a validation of every late night she had worked, every case she had fought, every sacrifice she had made to build a career dedicated to protecting the vulnerable. The HOA board, meanwhile, was frantically consulting with their legal counsel via phone, trying to understand their potential liability and the steps they needed to take to protect the community from Karen's unauthorized actions. The conversation was brief but decisive. Karen had to be immediately stripped of any perceived authority, banned from any enforcement activities, and potentially prosecuted to protect the community from further legal exposure. When the room finally quieted, Mr. Foster stood to address the gathering with obvious nervousness. After consulting with our legal counsel and reviewing the evidence presented tonight, the HOA board is taking immediate action. Mrs. Hendricks is hereby banned from any enforcement activities, official or unofficial, within this community. Her access to HOA materials, letterhead, and facilities is immediately revoked. He paused, consulting notes his lawyer had given him over the phone. Additionally, any violation notices, fines, or restrictions she has issued without proper authority are hereby declared null and void. Residents who have paid fees or penalties based on her unauthorized citations will receive full refunds with interest. The announcement brought applause from the gathered residents. But Maria wasn't finished. Mr. Foster, those administrative actions address the community's liability, but they don't address the criminal behavior that was committed against my son. Mrs. Hendricks assaulted a minor while committing acts of discrimination. Those are crimes that carry legal consequences beyond HOA sanctions. Karen finally found her voice, standing on shaking legs to address Maria directly. Please, I never meant to hurt anyone. I was just trying to maintain order and standards. I made a mistake, and I'm sorry. Can't we just put this behind us and move forward? Maria studied Karen's face for a long moment, seeing not the authoritarian bully who had terrorized her son, but a broken woman who had finally realized the consequences of her actions. When she spoke, her voice was firm but not cruel. Mrs. Hendricks, what you did to my son wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. You chose to grab him. You chose to humiliate him. And you chose to exclude him based on his appearance. Children across this community have been watching to see how adults respond to discrimination and bullying. She stood, gathering her materials with deliberate precision. I'll be filing formal charges tomorrow morning for assault of a minor and civil rights violations. The community has the right to know that actions have consequences, and my son has the right to see that justice exists even when adults fail to protect children. The legal proceedings that followed moved with surprising speed, aided by the clear video evidence and the 17 witness statements Maria had collected. Karen was formally charged with assault of a minor and civil rights violations, charges that would likely result in probation, mandatory community service, and a permanent record that would prevent her from ever again claiming authority over others. More importantly for the community's healing, Karen was required to make a public apology to Sam and participate in sensitivity training about discrimination and child development. The apology, delivered at the community pool on a Saturday morning when most families were present, was awkward and clearly painful for Karen, but it served an important purpose for the children who witnessed it. Sam stood beside his mother as Karen read her prepared statement, his posture straighter and more confident than it had been in months. The community had rallied around him in ways that had surprised and moved him. With neighbors he barely knew stopping by to invite him to barbecues, pool parties, and other activities. Tommy Chen had organized a swimming buddies group that met every afternoon, making the pool a place of friendship rather than exclusion. "I want to apologize to Sam Martinez and his family for my inexcusable behavior," Karen read, her voice barely audible above the sound of water filtering through the pool system. "I had no right to put my hands on a child, to make cruel comments about his appearance, or to exclude him from community facilities. I allowed my personal prejudices to override my basic human decency, and I am deeply sorry for the harm I caused." Sam had prepared his own statement with his mother's help, and he stepped forward to address not just Karen, but the entire community that had gathered to witness this moment of accountability. "I forgive you, Mrs. Hendricks," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the pool deck. "What you did hurt me, but it also showed me how many good people live in our community. I hope you can learn to be one of those good people too." The grace and maturity of his response brought tears to many eyes, including Karen's, and marked the beginning of a healing process that would transform not just individual relationships, but the entire community's approach to inclusion and mutual respect. 6 months later, Willowbrook Community had become something of a model for inclusive neighborhood governance. The HOA board had implemented new policies requiring training for anyone involved in community management, established clear procedures for reporting harassment, and created a community wellness committee focused on ensuring that all residents felt welcome and supported. Sam had become something of a local celebrity, not because of the incident with Karen, but because of his remarkable progress as a swimmer and his leadership in organizing community activities that brought neighbors together. The Swimming Buddies group had evolved into a community-wide fitness initiative that included residents of all ages and abilities, making the pool area a hub of positive activity rather than exclusion. Maria, meanwhile, had used the experience to inform her work as Attorney General, developing new initiatives focused on protecting children from discrimination in housing and community settings. She had also made changes in her own life, adjusting her work schedule to ensure she could attend more of Sam's activities and be more present for the everyday moments that had taken on new significance after nearly losing them to someone else's cruelty. Karen had completed her community service requirement by volunteering at a local children's advocacy center, where she worked with kids who had experienced various forms of trauma and discrimination. The experience had been transformative, forcing her to confront the impact of adult behavior on vulnerable children and ultimately leading her to become an advocate for the very kids she had once targeted. On this particular Saturday afternoon, as Sam executed a perfect backstroke across the length of the pool while his friends cheered from the shallow end, Maria sat in her poolside chair, reading case files and occasionally looking up to watch her son's joy. The afternoon sun cast ripples of light across the water, creating patterns that seemed to dance with possibility and hope. Mrs. Patterson approached with 2 cups of lemonade, settling into the chair beside Maria with the comfortable familiarity of friendship that had grown from shared crisis. "He's looking strong," she observed, nodding toward Sam as he transitioned into a smooth freestyle stroke. "He is strong," Maria replied, accepting the lemonade with a grateful smile. "Stronger than I realized, and stronger than he knew himself to be. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us reveal the best parts of who we can become." They sat in comfortable silence, watching as Sam surfaced at the deep end of the pool and raised his arms in triumph at completing his longest continuous swim yet. His friends erupted in applause, and even some of the adults joined in, creating a celebration that felt like a community-wide affirmation of growth, healing, and the power of standing together against injustice. The story of what had happened at Willowbrook Community spread far beyond their neighborhood boundaries, becoming a case study in how communities could respond to discrimination and how individual courage could inspire collective action. But for Maria and Sam, the most important outcome wasn't the broader impact or the legal precedent they had established. The most important outcome was this: a summer afternoon where a boy could swim with his friends, supported by a community that had learned to see strength in diversity and beauty in inclusion, where a mother could watch her son thrive, knowing that the neighborhood they called home had proven itself worthy of that trust, where justice hadn't just been served in a courtroom, but had been lived out in daily acts of kindness, acceptance, and the simple recognition that every child deserves to feel safe and valued. As the afternoon stretched toward evening and the pool began to empty, Sam pulled himself from the water and ran to his mother, still dripping and glowing with the satisfaction of another successful swimming session. "Mom," he said, wrapping his wet arms around her shoulders without concern for her dry clothes. "This was the best day ever." Maria hugged him back, feeling the strength in his arms and the confidence in his posture, knowing that both had been hard-won through trials no child should have to face, but grateful beyond measure for the community that had rallied around them and the justice system that had proven itself capable of protecting the vulnerable when called upon to do so. "Yes, mijo," she agreed, watching the sun set over a community that had learned to live up to its best possibilities rather than settle for its worst fears. "It really was,"